is research that he's led, but some of it we're partnering directly with, and I'm familiar with all of it. So I think I will do this modified version of that presentation justice, and I think it'll be really valuable to people wondering about existing native ground cover and restoration of native ground cover. So again, Kevin Robertson, he's the program director at Tall Timbers, and I'm assuming many of you have at least heard of Tall Timbers, but what we are is a research station and land conservancy, so we have research scientists as well as people who work with private landowners to get their land under conservation easement and other things there in the land conservancy. But Kevin and I are both in the fire ecology program, and we focus specifically on plants and fire. And we also have someone who's here for 2 years working on an ecosystem services project that is, I think, pretty relevant that I'll end on, that looks at the benefits, the additional ecosystem services you get with restoration through time. Okay, and so today's talk will be about fire, but not all of it is. I'm going to kind of start with the plants and lead to the fire. So first of all, using results from a number of studies, so I'm not going to go in depth on one study like Joe did, but kind of touch on a number of different studies that are similar. How does species composition differ in native ground cover sites versus sites affected by soil disturbance? So what's different between native and soil disturbed sites? And when I say soil disturbance, it's hard to lump it all together, and it shouldn't really be lumped all together because it is, as Joan pointed out, and it depends. Something like chopping is different than being in agriculture for decades, for example. But we're finding that disturbances do affect the native plant communities in the ground cover, and that has implications for fire. So the second question that I'll get to a little later in the presentation are what are the implications of these differences in native ground cover sites for flammability and fire behavior. So, as everyone here knows, these ecosystems, longleaf pine ecosystems, there's a number of different types of longleaf pine ecosystems, but they need frequent fire. And the fuels are really important with how well, the nature of the fuels influences how well that system will burn. So, you guys have mostly, I think probably everyone has participated in prescribed burning, right? Raise your hand if you've done prescribed burning. Yeah, everybody. Okay, so you know that fire is going to move through different fuels quite differently. This is from the Red Hills region, and today's research will focus on the Red Hills region, where we have upland longleaf pine, and we have voltasols. So we're interested, we are working also on a synthesis of soil disturbance effects on plant communities across the distribution of longleaf, and in some cases it seems like you can make some generalizations, and in other cases it's a little less safe to do so, because the soils are really important. But so switching to upland pine voltasols in this talk. And then one side note on some research that I've been getting deeply involved in, but I won't talk too much about today, is some more evidence. So we all know from land management that you have to burn these systems or massive changes happen, right? We just know that we need the fire in order to prevent major changes in ecosystem structure and function. But tree rings, and I have some history with tree rings going back to my master's and a little bit during my PhD as well, using fire scars within longleaf pine now, that I'm now here at Tall Timbers, to learn about fires that happened before we have strong records of that. So sometimes going back into the 1600s even, records of very frequent fire. And I'm working really closely with Dr. Jean Huffman. Some of you may know a lot of the wood that we're analyzing together, she actually collected. This is from the buffer preserve, actually. So we are reconstructing fire frequency and also fire seasonality to see what kind of shifts might happen, how much variability was there in frequency and seasonality through time. But the big picture and why I'm putting this in here now is that we know that it just provides further justification for frequent fire in longleaf pine ecosystems through time. Okay, and then some of you may have seen this paper, and David, maybe we can put it, if it's not the shared publications, it might be a nice one for some of you. I think it's a cool concept that extends beyond longleaf to globally grasslands, savannas, and woodlands, kind of arguing that a little bit, you know, the old growth concept is always focused on the trees. But actually, and this is something that Joan talked about a little bit, the plants can live, the understory plants can live really long periods of time as well. And I think that it would be neat to do more research on exactly how long-lived some of these plants are. But the argument made here by Veldman et al., and other people have suggested this before this paper for some of our longleaf pine grasslands, is that the understory is old growth. And even though when we burn it, you know, the above ground biomass disappears, those same plants keep coming up year after year. A similarity across these systems that Veldman pick out is sensitivity to soil disturbance. So that's what I'm going to be getting in today. Because they're so dependent on resprouting, it's really important that those underground storage organs stay intact. A lot of the perennial plants tend to have limited dispersal ability, and we know that many of the species are fire enhanced or dependent on fire for their flowering and fruiting. So here's just a few photos from the Red Hills. Wiregrass and a number of other species after you burn come up super quick, right, from those underground storage organs. And here's some images of a few species and just what that looks like. So again, I'm not aware, and if someone else is, I'd be curious to know of people who have actually documented exactly how old some of the herbaceous plants are and the woody plants outside of the trees. But when you dig up these underground organs, you see how substantial they are, and that's what allows the plants to resprout after fire. So we have Queen's Delight, Goat's Rue, Dwarf Huckleberry, Dixie White-topped Aster, and Bracken Fern here. But they look a little different depending on the species, but we find this for a number of our herbaceous and woody plants, that they have really significant mass underground. A project that I've been leading in the last couple of years that Kevin established many years ago is this is part of a larger study looking at woody stem resprouting each year in variable fire frequency. So we have plots that are burned every 2, 3, and 5 years. And what we're finding, we go back, each one is tagged, each genet is tagged, and year after year, regardless of the 2, 3, or 5 year, so far, regardless of fire frequency, the plants continue. We find the same plants, they're still there. One plant that I've noticed that seems to be a little less true of is Ruscopolinum. It seems we find a lot more of those that are dead and also new resprouts, but most of the plants, we have a carefully mapped, so this is a blank map, but we have them all individually tagged and mapped, and we are usually able to relocate every single plant. So I think it'd be really cool to get something like this going for decades and see, you know, how long are these plants returning. And we should think about our longleaf pine systems. We have old trees, but we also have a very old understory. Okay, so moving on to soil disturbance, I'm going to start by discussing kind of the most extreme version of that, so looking at old fields. And a number of other researchers have done this too, looking at plant communities in old fields versus native intact ground cover and seeing how that differs. So this first study looked at plant communities in native longleaf and a native shortleaf, as well as old field sites in the Red Hills region. So here's a quick map that shows kind of these types are spread out across the study area. This is just south of Thomasville, Georgia, north of Tallahassee. And here we can see that the species composition does differ by site type. So similar kind of analysis as you saw in the previous presentation, where it's grouping similar things together in space. And we can see old field sites here in red. These are our shortleaf sites. And then we also have these longleaf sites. So there is some spread, but in general we do have different species composition. And I'm going to get in a little bit more detail in the next slide. So there were 3 sites in this particular study: Tall Timbers, Pebble Hill, and Avalon. And we found a total of 289 species. About half of those species occurred in both the old field and the longleaf sites, but you can see there are some species that are only occurring in our longleaf site or are only occurring in the old field sites. And there's more total species, of course, in the native sites than in the old field sites, biodiversity. So here you can see some differences kind of by these coarse categories. So we had more graminoids in our native sites, a little fewer forbs and vines, more native woodies, and fewer off-site woodies. And here the off-site woodies are things like sweet gum, live oak, what's the other big one I'm forgetting? Water oak, laurel oak. So things that are a little less flammable. There's more of those in the old field sites. And this slide shows the percent cover of the most common species in the native longleaf versus the old field. And the color is not really related to the research, but was something that Kevin and I helped add that kind of just makes your eyes focus on flammability. So we didn't do flammability studies of these plants, but we kind of tried to highlight in red ones that we know from burn experience burn better, and put in blue ones that maybe are a little less apt to burn. So what you start to see is that the native species are much more flammable generally than the old field sites, and that the lists are different. So I think there's only one, I might have missed, I didn't look, I think I just see one here, southern red oak, that appears on both sides, but generally the most common species by cover in native longleaf sites is completely different than the most common species in the old field sites. And then what do we see at the top of the native longleaf site? Wiregrass, and it's a huge percentage of the cover, and as everybody knows, it burns really well. So we shouldn't actually consider all of these equal when we think about what's covering almost a third of the landscape, at least at our sites in the Red Hills there, wiregrass and the implications for being able to burn that land well is very important.
When you say percent of cover, are you talking vertical cover and horizontal cover, or?
I believe Kevin collected this before my time, but I think it's just horizontal cover. Yeah. Okay, so then, there's a lot of old field sites that have been fallow now for decades. That's what this research is based on. But then currently, and this is a controversial and difficult topic that Tall Timbers is actually wrestling with right now, is modern day soil disturbance, especially disking. So this study focuses on disking, but I'm not trying to say that all soil disturbance is equal. Things like roller chopping, well done timber activity can disturb the soil pretty minimally, but disking is actually pretty substantial in terms of tearing the roots up, turning them over, so it can have some pretty substantial impacts. So what's different though compared to the old field studies is that we're talking about really small spatial scales. So we look to see whether or not these really narrow disturbances of an old fire break that had been abandoned for a few years, and then a recent single disc line, whether or not species composition differs there versus in the neighboring, you can see the wiregrass, in the neighboring intact vegetation. So some of the reasons why disking is going on, and again tomorrow at Tall Timbers, we're actually having an internal discussion about soil disturbance and kind of how we want to discuss that with the public, because people will call and ask us about this. Because what are some of the reasons that people disc and otherwise disturb soil now for management? There are some benefits for management.
Breed fields.
What's that? Brood fields.
Quail breed fields.
Yeah, so that's a huge one. And in the Red Hills, so much of our land is protected because of quail and that history of quail, and quail are very important. And a lot of people, are concerned about the possibility of saying, okay, well, brood fields, if they're in native ground cover, maybe that's a problem. Brood fields not in native ground cover, maybe that's okay, but in native ground cover, given what we're finding about how drastically that and long-term the changes can be on the vegetation community, is that something that we necessarily want to suggest, although it definitely does provide some benefits for quail. Yeah, that was the big one I was hoping to get out. Are there other? reasons that people can think of? Site prep for logging, fire breaks. I guess there's a number of different reasons, but those are a few that I can think of offhand. So yeah, we're trying to figure out. I'm kind of getting to the end before the beginning, I'm realizing here, but I'll present some more of the results of our study to kind of show that some of these disturbances, people should at least think very carefully about whether or not they want to do that in native ground cover, given what we found about the differences between the species. So these are the species that are significantly associated with the undisturbed area. And again, it's similar list than the first list, but we see wiregrass right there at the top. A number of these species are very flammable, important species that are, this doesn't mean they don't occur in undisturbed areas, but they're much more likely to occur in disturbed areas. And then these are the species that were associated with the disc line. So these are the results from just one disc line. I think that in this case, the burn manager, a fire was kind of getting out of control, so it was like he needed to use a disc line just on one afternoon, kind of unplanned, and that's where we did this study. And you can see differences in those species lists, right? So some of the species can occur in both habitats, but we definitely see big differences, and there's fewer of those really flammable species in that second list. These aren't invasive species, though, right? So these are not necessarily all like bad species, but some of them can be, and some of them are native species that we just don't expect to be as common without soil disturbance. Hitting on that wiregrass concept again, we have a lot more wiregrass in the undisturbed areas than in our disc lines. And kind of a suggestion, although this is definitely not always feasible, especially if you're managing a lot of land and you have to accomplish a lot of burning. But what we do at Pebble Hill, where we do a lot of our research, and we do research burns there every summer, is actually mow fire breaks. So if you have the resources and time to do that, that can actually be extremely effective. So just within a few weeks before the burn, Kevin actually just uses his regular lawnmower, and then we rake with yard rakes. And yeah, so again, it's not necessarily practical across larger scales, but if you have really sensitive native ground cover, especially if you have a property that you only have a little bit that's a native ground cover, disc fire breaks elsewhere, and maybe consider mowing where you still have native vegetation. Okay, so so again, when I was putting red and blue species earlier, that was kind of just intuitive based on experience with prescribed burning. But we also did actually look at fuels and then fire behavior in disturbed versus old field sites. So jumping right to some results here, the fuels are definitely different between the native and the old field sites. So you can see the little blue asterisks tell you the significance. And we have native on the left in each case and old field on the right. And the y-axis is fuel load. So you can see a lot more dead grass in native sites, more needle litter. Those are key to prescribed fires, of course. More live herbs. We didn't find differences in this particular study with hardwood litter, although I'm sure if we looked at the species of hardwoods, we might have seen differences, but lumping all the hardwood litter together, we don't see differences there. More 1 hour fuels when things are collected together here in this category in our native sites, we see differences there as well. So this is from, this research has been published in Robertson and Ostertag, so I can also put that one in the shared folder for you guys to look at more carefully if you'd like to. So in addition to collecting fuels and just comparing fuels before fire, we also conducted prescribed burns to look at and monitored fire behavior to look at differences between those native sites and old field sites. So you can see differences in area burned, so more complete burns in the native sites, kind of regardless of 1 year or 2 year post-burn. And also more top kill of hardwood species. So that again carries for both of those categories, the native sites, you can accomplish an important goal that a big reason why a lot of the prescribed burning happens is to kind of top kill those hardwoods, and that is easier to accomplish in native sites. Here's the results of fire behavior. So I'll just point out a couple of them. So you can see longer flame length in native sites, higher rate of spread. And here, these ones are all kind of indicators of fire intensity, and we can see higher intensity, which that helps explain this result here in our native versus our old field sites. This research I haven't been involved in at all, but it's really neat and important, especially given potential concerns of prescribed burning being threatened by concerns with air quality, right? So I think it's really important that Kevin Robertson and his collaborators have found that it's actually better, you get fewer emissions in native sites versus old field sites. So this is a structural equation model that Kevin produced with his colleagues that I don't fully understand, but the EF is the emission factor, which is used to calculate, you multiply that by other things to calculate the emissions from a burn. And 2 important points from here is that the percent of grass, the higher percent grass, the lower total emissions. Needles actually have a different effect. So if you have just a plantation type scenario without a lot of understory, then that's actually going to, as you probably have seen, smokier burns that will actually increase the emission factor. So more herbaceous vegetation, at least grass in this model, lower total emission factor. Okay, so again, this talk isn't really about how to do restoration, but more what are the benefits, right? So some of the advantages for either conserving what native ground cover you have or working towards restoring native ground cover is high biodiversity, more flammable fuels, and the more flammable the fuels are, the easier it is to achieve your burn objectives. So I can't remember if I'm going to show the slide even if I took it out. I put it in the very end, or maybe it's next. Can't remember. But at Tall Timbers, we've been able to push our window. We're an old field site, I should say. So a lot of the research that we do in native sites is not on Tall Timbers property. It's north of there. But our old field site, through good management, through time, really regular burning, we are able to push our burn window further into the summer. So initially, our current land manager, who's been with us for over a decade, I think less than 2 decades, I'm not sure exactly when he came on. When he first came, all of the burning was happening kind of in February and March. Things just wouldn't burn later in the season. But the more burning he's doing, the more grassy the fuels are becoming, and he's able to push those burns further back in time, opening the window for when burning can be accomplished on our property. So, and that gets that kind of less mechanical management being needed. Thinking about top killing, if you have a higher amount of that, then there's less post-burn mowing that you need to do, for example. You can accomplish more with just your fire. And as the recent slide showed, you can end up reducing your emissions, which I think it's really important to actually publish and kind of prove that point as an argument for keeping prescribed burning in our longleaf systems. Okay, so I went back and forth. It's like, how well does this fit in this talk? But I did include this map, and I know the numbers are too small, but we used to burn again a lot in March and even in February. March is now, this is just for 1 year in 2015, but March is this pinkish color, and April is this teal color, May in purple, and a little bit even in orange in June. So an earlier map of this, which isn't in here, would have shown a lot less later season burning, which, as some of you know, seasonality is important. Frequency is number 1, but seasonality is important for a lot of the understory plants, and we do try to kind of push back our burning a little bit later through time. Okay, so if you have native ground cover, we do suggest, although again tomorrow we're having this internal, it's just an interesting timing, I don't know maybe I would have changed a couple things if it was switched the other way, but we're trying to reach a consensus about at-tall timbers on this. But from the plant ecology, fire ecology side, we definitely think that soil disturbance should be minimized, and the research shows that, especially really intense soil disturbance such as disking. So you can use natural and existing fire breaks, mowing instead of chopping, following logging best management practices, so things that limit the amount of soil disturbance associated with logging, like not getting in there when it's way too wet, for example. Using frequent fire, and also keeping your pines at a low enough basal area. So if they get too dense, then we have a lot more needles and not as much herbaceous, so that's another key point there. Okay, so I have just a few slides. How am I doing? Okay. I just have a few slides on ongoing research that's going to continue to look at other aspects of this, and this is the study that I hinted at when I introduced Cinnamon Morrison, who joined us earlier this year as part of a grant that Kevin secured from the Agricultural and Food Research Initiative to examine how ecosystem services vary with time since restoration. So it's kind of a chronosequence approach where we have old field land, and then we have land that was old field but has been burned regularly versus intact vegetation, and looking at how ecosystem services vary across that gradient. So some of the services are things just like biodiversity. They're also collecting pollinators, looking at soil differences to try to get a better idea of what are the benefits with restoration. And in this case, the restoration is just bringing back fire. So we're not looking at doing things like getting native species back in that aren't there anymore, or things of that nature. But this, I think, is kind of a hopeful initial diagram. So this study just started in May, but Kevin put together this diagram for a conference he just went to. And what the key point is here, if you see the native sites are up at the top, you can see that the further you are from time since soil disturbance, the closer it gets to a native site. So with time, and these are now being burned as well, with time we do approach plant communities that are closer to our native vegetation. And then I'm also working on a literature review that looks at the effects of various soil disturbances, agriculture, disking, chopping, on plant species. We're trying to see whether or not we can't make some generalization across large areas. So we've focused mostly in these upland pines, which possibly because of the soils might be the most sensitive to soil disturbance, because we have sands over clayey subhorizons that mixing really makes maybe a bigger difference than a simpler, sandier soil. We're not really sure. But I've kind of pooled, including Joan's work too, some of it, to look at whether or not we can see some similarities across study areas, and some plants seem to be a lot more sensitive to soil disturbance than others. So we're kind of classifying plants into these guilds of ones that even a minimal amount of disturbance, which unfortunately wiregrass, which is one of the most important in terms of fire, seems to be one of the most sensitive. Versus other native plants that are also important for flammability are maybe a little less sensitive. Some plants actually that are part of the native ground cover benefit and increase after soil disturbance. So we're kind of trying to see whether or not we can make some generalizations about that based on the existing literature, and contributing some of the work we've done in the Red Hills as well. Okay, so with that, thank you, and I'll take any questions.
Study that you were presenting, you said the grasses, more grass-dominated pinelands had lower emissions than ones that had a greater concentration of needles. Is that a lignin-related phenomenon? The higher amount of lignin in a pine needle than in a grass?
I actually do not know. I don't know if anyone here has any insights on that. I'm not sure that particular paper doesn't offer an explanation necessarily for why it's different, but it fits with observations and just the smokiness of those fuels, but I'm not sure.
And then also when you talk about soil disturbance and certain species being more susceptible or more sensitive to it rather, how are you characterizing the level of soil disturbance and the effects, I guess, on the biogeochemistry of the soil, like increased water retention because of creation of divots and stuff could benefit species, right? But then also, like you said, you're disturbing the horizonation of the soil. Are you saying that soil disturbance is a destructive force primarily, or positives and negatives?
Positive and negatives come out from the synthesis we're doing. So some species, it kind of depends on the species, and we're not sure, and that's what a part of the goal of this synthesis is, whether it's some species only in certain ecosystem types, or whether it's, if that applies to Frosia virginiana in sandhill and upland pine, for example. But what we're finding, again, this is still underway, is that it seems like kind of across our study area that there are some plants that, regardless of the disturbance even, don't benefit from that. Other plants, maybe it depends. A little bit of soil disturbance, they increase. More intense disturbance, they decrease. And then there's some plants that actually do a lot better following soil disturbance. So in terms of the mechanisms, this study doesn't look at that because we're using other studies that have done similar things where you have a certain disturbance and you compare that to an undisturbed site, just looking at the differences in the plants and not necessarily trying to address the mechanism. So it's not like an experiment where we are putting in soil disturbance of different types and severities and then looking at the response. We're kind of using existing disturbances and comparing those communities. So again, probably can't fully answer that question either.
I think one of our challenges on some of our restoration, we have the mature overstory trees, but we also have those long-lived species that you were talking about with their vitis, their smilac. And we have a tremendous trouble trying to get consistent fire in there to control those species to allow those fine fuels. Is Tall Timbers addressing any of that in their research about controlling the vines and in the early parts of getting the fire established?
Not from the research standpoint, but I know that our land manager, areas that don't burn as well, he tries to burn them when it's especially dry, and areas that he knows the earlier burns that he completes are in areas that he knows will burn. You know what I mean? So kind of saving those areas that are harder to burn for those burn days that are more likely to have higher fire intensity. But we haven't looked at that in a research standpoint.
They seem to be long-lived perennials that are really hard to get
Yeah, I don't think that the goal should necessarily be getting rid of those plants, but maybe getting them to be a smaller stature and less prominent.
Right.
Might be more
well,
realistic.
we have them that they cover the ground.
That covers everything.
Right, and they don't allow
Yeah, and I do know of some studies that have shown things like roller chopping being effective, and like I said, especially with saw palmetto and things like that. I'm working in upland pine, so the saw palmetto's not a major component, but in some settings there are reasons where soil disturbance might be a necessary thing in order to accomplish burn objectives, but it just needs to be considered carefully because it can have influences on the plant composition. Some other questions?
Yeah, sure. If you go back, if you're able, could you go back to the slide where you show the differences, or maybe it's the similarities rather, in the below ground biomass of the fire adapted plants? The big taproots and stuff.
Oh, okay, just that photo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are any of the plants in that have those significant underground investments, are they ones that are less affected by soil disturbance? The ones with the woodier, deeper, straight down, as opposed to the lateral, fine roots.
I am not sure about that. We haven't done a study that compares that, but I would think that ones with the deeper wouldn't necessarily be less sensitive if it's broken off from the surface. You know what I mean? I'm not sure, but I'm just wondering if well below the ground, if all that's left is a little bit at the very bottom, can it still resprout? That's a good question. I really don't know. But yes.
Along the same lines, we all look at soil disturbance as a depth. I mean, because the depth can vary depending on whether or not you're doing a fire plow or a light disking. So.
Yeah. So again, we have studies in old fields, so we know that that's really extensive, intense disturbance that occurred over long periods of time, really destructive. And then our studies of these other disturbances have been in really small disk lines, and that's what we've looked at. So we haven't covered the full gradient with our research, but in this synthesis that I'm now working on, this literature review, I'm hoping to get a wider spread of, and being able to potentially look at how differences in intensity, length, extent, and soil depth would be a possibility as well, how that influences the response.
Depends on your species.
Yes, and that's what we expect is for some species, they'll be more sensitive to even light disturbance where others are more tolerant.
Were these photos taken from the natural sites or from old fields, or do you know?
I believe that Kevin dug these up from a native site at Pebble Hill Plantation. Yes.
I think one of the challenges of thinking about disturbance also is really that it has impacts at different scales. So if you look at disturbance, it can kill an individual plant, but if your concern is the composition or the integrity of the entire community or the integrity of the landscape and its function with fire, the impacts of disturbance the answer can be really different. So it can be devastating to an individual plant, but I think many of the disturbances, the man-made disturbances, are, well, and natural ones too, are episodic in time and in space. So that at a larger scale, at a community scale, that's a different question, maybe with a different answer. And that gets to my wrestling with the question of how right do you have to be, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. 'Cause that's something I've thought about with this single disc line. You know, even though, oops, I'm in the wrong spot, but you guys know what slide I'm looking at. Even though we're showing huge differences in plant composition, we're talking about just a little portion of that overall property. It's not like if you disc in one area, the entire area is transformed. So I think larger scale, larger extent is a concern. And the other thing though is even these small disturbances, they do persist for decades. So it is kind of, you might think, okay, well I'm just doing this in one little spot, but you have to kind of think of it as being something that can leave. So I can kind of see both sides of it. And again, I think there's not really enough knowledge that doing that is going to put a lasting change. And that's the real point that I think, at least at Tall Timbers, we want to communicate, is that at minimum, people at least know that if they're disking, putting in brood plots in native ground cover, that's going to create lasting effects in the understory vegetation. Whether or not they decide to do that, we might not. We'll decide tomorrow what our standpoint is going to be on that. But that might be up. You know, that's going to vary depending on the landowner, and what their goals are.
When I was working with National Forest, I mean, we flip-flopped on that argument that it's very localized, you know, and look how many millions of acres or hundreds of thousands of acres we have, and it's so localized. But then one of the worries that people had was this slippery slope. Well, it's just a little bit, and it's just a little bit more, and it's just a little bit more. And it's that accumulation. And because there's the recovery or the healing of that is longer than my lifetime,
Right.
That's when you begin to worry about, you know, it is hard.
I think there's also some somewhat disconcerting patterns about where let's say a fire break that's put in during a wildfire, how that sort of strategically affects the thing on the other side. So frequently if there's a wildfire on the National Forest, they'll put a line down to keep the fire from getting into a wetland, which makes sense because they don't want to have to go out and babysit that wetland while it smokes for weeks and weeks. But that disc line now is going to forever affect the trajectory of that wetland because
Yes.
you're never going to get the momentum of the fire once it hits that line. And your evidence of the species that come in after that disturbance and how that affects the intensity and height and all that stuff of the fire, that translates to all that woody growth that's going to happen right on the other side of that burn line for decades.
Yeah,
And
that's
something to think about.
That's what I was thinking about those, even though those are, I was thinking about that actual disposition, or where do you put it? And so when you think about what are the risks or what are the consequences, that is the same disturbance at one place might not be the same at another place. So
Yeah.
it's in terms of plant community, and but starting and looking at individual species impacts is a good place to start.
Great. Cool. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you.